Welcome to another webinar. We thought we'd chat through everything shoes today. It can be very difficult buying shoes.
Yes.
I know there's so many bits of information out there and marketing often gets in the way. So
yes, it's just as much of an art form as it is a science. And there's a lot of marketing and red herrings involved as well to sort of throw you off the scent.
Yeah, and there's nothing worse than spending $200 and then someone else pointing out why you've chosen the wrong shoe.
Yeah.
So, we thought we'd just chat through some of the, pitfalls, the things to look out for. It really comes down to what type of running you're doing, what sort of terrain, what your feet are like, what you want to get out of your shoes as well. So basically, we just want to give you the tools so you know how to make the best informed decision possible.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump into it. If you've got any questions along the way, obviously reach out.
Okay, so I think first thing we all need to realize is that running shoes is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so there's a lot of brand loyalty and these things, and, you know, a lot of sponsorship as well. So I remember when I was in New York last year with the marathon team, everyone was running in the new Nikes, every single person. And yeah, apparently they're super fast, but it's really interesting. There's almost like flavors of the month when it comes to running shoes. Like a few years ago, we had the minimalist craze. And so we do need to appreciate, like anything, it's an industry, and some of it's based on science and some of it's based on marketing and emotions.
Yeah, I also think that when they come out with new models as well, it's basically the same shoe a lot of the time. But there's a new model because it's like phones in a way. It's like, how can we get people to buy the next version?
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah, it's definitely a lot of money to be made and lost in shoes.
Yeah, but if we were to trace the history of running shoes, it largely goes back to Nike, before it was Nike. I can't remember the guy's name who was the entrepreneur.
Phil Knight, isn't it?
He was the founder of Nike, but it was his running coach, Bill Bowerman. That's the name. Pretty sure. I'll have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it's Bill Bowerman. And he hypothesized that if they put cushioning under people's heels, they would run faster because their impact would be less. So that sort of became the basis of the running shoe, and he was always getting all his athletes to experiment with different shoes. So Phil Knight tells all these stories about he was always designing shoes for them to run in. I mean, if you haven't read Shoe Dog, it's a great book.
Oh, I love it. Actually, highly recommend. It's really
highly recommend. It's all about the beginnings of Nike. But from that, we began to develop this running shoe, which was largely based on stability, so preventing foot collapse. And also providing cushioning specifically under the heel, because I thought if people had more cushioning under the heel, they'd be able to get off the ground faster. So that's sort of the history of the shoe. However, as we're about to find, both of those things are still just theoretical and they're not actually backed by evidence a lot of the time. So we're about to break that down a little bit for you now.
Yeah, definitely.
So first of all, we need to discuss, is it bad to be flat-footed? So we have this, you know, a lot of people talk about being flat-footed or having these collapsed arches. The scientific term is overpronation. And pronation is normal. Pronation is normal. It's the shock absorption phase of gait. So when you actually hit the floor, you will pronate. That's really normal, and it's actually really necessary because it's how you absorb shock. What is the issue is when people can't get out of pronation. So at push-off, they're still pushing off, and their foot is still rolled in. They haven't actually created an arch using the intrinsic muscles of their foot to push off and propel themselves forward. And, you know, I've watched slow motion videos of swimmers as well when they're diving out of the blocks. And when they're about to dive out of the blocks, they do the same thing. They create these arches in their feet to help them propel themselves forward. So contrary to popular belief, overpronation or being flat-footed is not a risk factor for running injury, which is really interesting. And it's not just that there is a lack of evidence to say that it is associated with risk with injuries. There is evidence to say it is not a risk factor for injury. There's lots of systematic reviews that have shown that. Is it still something we consider? Absolutely, because it tells us what is your strategy, right? How are you loading through your foot, and could you be better at propulsion? Potentially, yes. However, it's not a risk factor for injury, so that's the first thing. The second thing with all of that is a lot of these support shoes, these stability shoes, they've shown don't necessarily stop the overpronation of the foot. And interestingly, there was a study that came out recently that showed that people who were in the stability or motion control shoes who were overpronated had the highest amounts of injury out of the whole group, even when they put overpronated people in neutral shoes and those sorts of things. Then we also need to think about the opposite, because some people have really high arches, and what we see a lot and what the research tells us is actually the people with high arches are the ones who tend towards more bony injuries of the shins and of the feet, partly because they can't absorb shock as well. So there is this argument that maybe being overpronated or being a little bit flat-footed is actually a good thing as a runner, because it actually helps absorb shock. And in one study, they showed that overpronated runners actually had the less amount of injuries of the whole group. The least amount of injuries of the whole group. I'm good at English. But yeah, so definitely something to still consider, because it definitely is informative from a biomechanical point of view, and we're not going to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. I assess feet and I assess my arches on all my clients, but it's not something, you're necessarily doomed to injury if you have flat feet.
No, I think the other thing is a lot of people, when they do get in these supportive shoes, it quite often, their feet stop doing a lot of the work.
Yeah.
So their feet stop training the intrinsic muscles. So they find starting to use their feet again and change the feet patterns really difficult, because they just haven't done it for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to know that if you are in these supportive shoes, that quite often the shoe does a lot of the work and your feet sort of forget how to turn these intrinsic muscles on as well. So another reason, just pay attention to what type of shoes you're in, how you do or don't use your feet. And as Mike said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just be aware of it.
Yeah, which is why both of us are big proponents of, if you are in a supportive shoe, still spending time barefoot, and it doesn't get you out of doing your strengthening exercises for your feet. A lot of people think, I'm in these motion control shoes, that's it.
Yeah.
Feet are good. No, it means you have extra work to do.
100%.
So lots of features you can look at in the shoe.
There really are. So these are just a couple before we delve into how you actually sort of choose your shoes, there's a couple of features to understand. If you don't understand what these are, it's very hard to know what you're looking at when you see the marketing, the features of a shoe. So the first one is the heel toe offset. So this is often the thing to look at if you're determining if a shoe is high support or low support, so more your minimalist type shoe. It's the difference between, quite simply, where the heel is and the toe is. So your minimalist style shoes have a 0 mil heel to toe drop, meaning it's obviously flat, and that's when your feet tend to do more of the work, versus the high heel toe drop is where quite often you'll see the heel is wedged right up, and they're your more typically supportive shoes, and they're the more, I guess, traditional running shoes that we've seen the last probably 2 decades or so.
Yeah. The obvious exaggeration of that is a high heel. But even running shoes, most traditional running shoes, you think of them as having a little high heel because the heel's higher than the toes.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of an issue long term. Well, the argument is it could be a bit of an issue long term is because it chronically shortens your calf and your Achilles because your foot's never flat on the floor. And I don't know about you, but I have some clients who've been in high heels for years and their feet are like this. Like they can't even get it flat on the floor. So particularly when we know tight calves is a risk factor for shin injuries and for foot injuries and basically injuries below the knee.
Yeah, I encourage all female runners that I work with to try to spend as little time in heels as possible. Personally, I don't spend any time in heels because I just know that, as Mike said, they're just so terrible for our bodies. And the longer you spend in heels, the harder it is to transition back to either barefoot, even just walking, or then getting in your shoes and running again. The difference is just massive. So I would definitely limit time in heels. But we digress. Other features, things such as cushioning. So again, that's how supportive the shoe is. The flexibility. So sometimes if you get your running shoe and you try to bend it in half, if you can bend it in half really easily, obviously it's more flexible, versus some are really rigid. So the more rigid ones, the shoe tends to do, I guess, more of the work for you. The more flexible your foot's doing the work. Breathable, that can be great if you're doing things such as, steeplechase or running trails in the wet and you want some of the water to leak back out, or you just want your feet to be able to breathe. Weight, so how heavy the shoe is. So again, depending what you're running, so how far you're running, what sort of terrain you're running on. We'll discuss this later, but sometimes having a light shoe is amazing. If you're doing, say, track running at speed, for example, the lighter shoe means you're carrying less on your foot. So typically this is what you'll see track runners using. They're these really, really, really crazy light shoes. Whereas if you're doing, more distance running, that can put a lot of pressure and put a lot of work through your intrinsic feet muscles, your calf muscles. So maybe a slightly heavier shoe is better for some of the more endurance style. And then grip. So grip relates to what sort of terrain you're running on. So if you're on track, quite often you'll see people in spikes. If trail, you see those sort of lugs at the bottom of the shoe to help grip on the trail, particularly if it's been wet or it's muddy or slippery, or if you're running on the road. So just some quick features to look at when you're actually assessing shoes, and knowing what you're working with. Oh, no. All right. Sorry, guys. Check your shoes.
So,
I'll chat.
Yeah, you go, because I can say a lot about this.
Okay, so the first thing to note, we have so many thoughts on shoes. It's quite hilarious.
Yeah.
The first thing is there's obviously a big debate. You've probably heard many sides, potentially people saying work towards more barefoot style, minimalist style, others telling you you'll get injured and all the reasons you shouldn't do it. I think the most important thing is just to be aware of the fact that your shoe choice will impact how you run.
Mm-hmm.
So these more supportive shoes with the high heel drop that we were talking about before, think almost your semi-high heels type shoe, because the heel is so high, you are more likely to land on your heel as you run. So the potential risk here is some people that do wear these high heel to toe drop shoes sometimes overstride because the heel is so high. So if you are in these type of shoes, you're the kind of person that might want to think about cadence. So try to keep your cadence up to minimize your overstriding whilst in these higher heel drop shoe. Because there's not necessarily anything wrong with these shoes. If you're someone that does want to be in a more supportive shoe, that's fine. Just be aware of the potential risk. Minimalist style shoes, you're more likely to run in a natural style, more barefoot style, much more likely to land on your forefoot. If you've ever gone for a barefoot run, you'll find it's almost impossible to land on your heel because it hurts.
Yeah.
So in these shoes, it's very similar. So you're more likely to take on a forefoot strike, which also does mean you're more likely to be engaging your intrinsic foot and calf muscles more. So if you're someone that is thinking, hey, I actually want to move more towards this natural style of running, I'm going to buy a minimalist shoe, it's important that you do so gradually because your feet and calf muscles obviously need time to adjust to this extra load and extra work that you put them under. If you all of a sudden do all your training miles now in these minimalist shoes, you probably will have an injury because you're not used to it.
Yeah.
So it's important to introduce them gradually. So for example, just start by doing your warm up and cool down in these shoes, then swap into the shoes that you've been training in historically. And over time, maybe introduce just one session extra at a time in these shoes.
Yeah. I think a lot of the injuries that were associated, because a few years ago, everyone was moving towards minimalist shoes. And a lot of the injuries that were associated with that was because people were transitioning too quickly. So to give you an idea, I'm in a barefoot shoe all day, every day. And I have been transitioning into a barefoot shoe with my running for over 2 years. And I'm still not there completely. So it's a long process. And I've been wearing barefoot shoes for longer than that, for about 4 years. all day, every day, the rest of the time. And I still haven't fully transitioned into them as my full-time running shoe yet. So
yeah, absolutely. Particularly because most people have, you know, worn the more supportive style shoe, which has traditionally been so popular for such a long time that they've had years and years of this style shoe. So making the transition does take time.
Yeah. And it might not be something that you ever fully get into the minimalist shoe all the time. And that's totally cool too. So be patient with it if it is something you want to do. And I think the other thing is a lot of people feel this need to be changing shoes. If you're comfortable in your shoes and they feel great and you're happy running in them, why do you need to change your shoe up?
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to. So yeah, that's the other thing as well. Don't feel pressured to be going into all these types of shoes and just going along with the fads just because everybody else seems to be.
Yeah, I think we were talking about something interesting before this webinar, which is this sort of almost weird pressure to feel the need to change. And at the end of the day, there are so many other important factors to your running as well. Like get your form and your technique and your training load and your different energy systems. Get all that stuff right first.
Yeah.
And the shoes, I mean, they're important, don't get us wrong, but yeah, there are so many other factors which will make a bigger difference to your consistency with training.
Yeah. I tell my patients, we can skip the slide, but I tell my patients all the time, you know, I hate talking about shoes with them because it's so overemphasized. I'm like, if you run like shit, it doesn't matter what shoe I put you in, you're still going to run like shit. And I literally use those words with them. And I'm like, if you're not strong enough to run, it doesn't really matter what shoe you're in. So all these intrinsic factors are so important and much more important to consider than what piece of rubber you have on the end of your foot.
Yeah.
So cushioning, and Kate, you just touched on this. So is more or less cushioning better? Well, here's just a little bit of a guide that we put together for you just to help you make that decision for yourself, right? So you might want more cushioning if the limiting factor is fatigue in your calves, feet, and ankles. So particularly on the long runs, if you feel like you're pulling up with like really sore calves, feet, and ankles, you want more cushioning, not less, because that cushioning is actually going to soften some of the impact through there. Same thing if you have calf, foot, or ankle pain. So, for example, a lot of patients with Achilles issues, we always put them in something with more cushioning, and we actually sometimes encourage them to go towards a bit of a heel strike because it will offload that area a little more as long as they're not overstriding. So that's like the one exception really that, you know, we give people. And then finally, if they're more comfortable, you may want to move towards less cushioning if you experience knee pain or overstriding, because when people have more cushioning, they tend towards heel striking and overstriding. And it's not so much heel striking as it is the overstriding that really predisposes people to knee pain. So by just giving people less cushioning, they tend to fix a lot of that. If they're more comfortable, if the limiting factor is general fatigue or feeling gassed, because a more cushioned shoe is generally heavier, so having less cushioning on your feet will be lighter. Or if you just want to move towards some of this midfoot or forefoot strike running patterns that we've been discussing. Yeah.
And one of the other important things to note, which I think is on the next slide, but relates to this, so I'll talk about it now, is don't be afraid to have two or more different types of shoes for different things. So you might be looking at the first one and you go, oh yeah, actually I do pull up sore in my calves, for example, at a long run. Maybe that's when you need to wear a shoe with slightly more cushioning. But on the other hand, you might go, oh, but I'm actually trying to run, I don't know, a 1K time trial PB and I've been doing lots of speed work or something like that. And maybe that more minimalist, lighter shoe would be perfect for that style of training. So maybe you actually have two different types of shoes for the different training sessions that you're doing. To complement the different training and the needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you'll have different limiting factors for different training sessions.
Exactly. Oh, doesn't want to move again.
Technology is not our friend today. What's going on?
Has it moved once?
Is that it? Yeah.
There we go.
Here we go. Terrain. I'll let you speak to this because you do a lot more trail than me.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the important thing to note here is that different shoes are designed for a specific type of terrain, and quite often people try to buy sort of a hybrid shoe because they're doing some of their running on the road or track and some of it on the trails. to be honest with you, the hybrid shoes never really are ideal for either type of terrain. So I definitely would recommend that. Obviously, it costs a little bit more money, but you just have a different shoe for each. So if you try to wear your road shoes out on the trails, you're really going to degrade them very, very fast, and they're not going to last as long. So if you are on the trails or you're running mountains, definitely get a pair of trail shoes. They don't have to be hugely heavy and bulky. It just means quite often they've got a sturdier sole. Quite often they've got the lugs too, again, to help with grip and that sort of thing. But they'll just break down much less quickly. Versus wearing those kind of shoes on road, maybe they're a bit bulky for that style of running. So I would recommend just having a specific shoe for each type of terrain. Even if it does sound like a large investment up front, the good thing is that that pair of shoes, since you have two of them, they're just going to last together twice as long. So it's kind of the same money. In the end, you're just spending it all up front. But know that, yeah, if you're wearing your road shoes on the trails, they probably will break down. And hybrid shoes typically tend to be a bit of a compromise to both. So personally, I would lean away from that. But again, it comes down to feel, and the comfort on your feet is the most important thing.
So yeah, we only have 2 rules, and they're really annoying rules. A lot of people are like to us, "That's it," and we're like, "Yeah." But what a relief, because it means you only have to do 2 things when you're buying shoes. It must be comfortable for you, and it must be lightweight. Consider all the other stuff as well, absolutely. But when we're really looking at the research is really contentious about what makes a perfect running shoe. And at the end of the day, personal preference is the biggest factor. So it has to, you have to make sure it feels comfortable for you. And by that, it can't be giving you blisters. It's got a wide enough toe box that, it's not too tight around the toes. And then it has to be lightweight, because a heavier running shoe will require more energy. Having said that, it's still got to have adequate cushioning for the distances that you're training in. So it's got to be relatively lightweight for the type of running that you're doing. When we're saying lightweight, we're not saying go run in a sandal.
Yeah.
But
everything's relative.
Yes, but they're the only 2 rules. So
the other point to make here is, if you are planning on racing in a specific pair of race shoes, please practice in them first. We actually do work with, see some runners and then talk to them about it, obviously, who keep their pair of race day shoes reserved for, the 3 times a year that they race in them. And then they get halfway through the race on race day and find that, they actually have a huge blister because the shoes feel terrible because they haven't practiced in them. So definitely practice in your race day shoes. The other important thing I would say is it's definitely worth investing in good running socks. So the Injinji toe socks are amazing. Nike, 2XU, basically anything designed for running. You don't have to spend crazy money. But it makes such a big difference, honestly. You'll really reduce your likelihood of blisters. They're so much more comfy. Could not emphasize enough.
Toe socks in particular for me have been really beneficial from the blister point of view.
Yeah, I agree. They take a little while to get on sometimes. But they're comfy. And then changing shoes. So I think a lot of people forget to change shoes sometimes. And what was once a really, really comfy shoe and perfect for them with the ideal amount of cushioning and all those things, they wear for 3 years and don't realize how far it's degraded and it's no longer doing the job that it once was. So it depends what your overall training load is, but try to pay attention to it. It feels like the shoes have sort of lost that springy feel, or they're no longer as comfy as you remember. Maybe around that 4 to 7 months is typically a bit of a guide. It's probably time to turn them over. You're much better off just spending the money on replacing the shoes than wearing them for too long, trying to get away with it for an extra 6 months and potentially doing an injury, which is going to cost more in the long run. And it's just annoying. If you do replace your shoes, try to find if there's a local donation. There are lots of companies which take in old running shoes, amazing cause, give them to countries where people don't have enough shoes. So just a side note, definitely try to do that if you can.
And then I think the final point to consider is that changes in footwear, even if it's into the exact same model of shoe, just transitioning from an old version of that shoe into a new version of shoe. They're still very different shoes, and so any change in footwear is a risk factor for injury. So you have to make the transition gradual. So we've both seen a lot of runners who, you know, they were transitioning from an old Nike Air or whatever into a new Nike Air, and then got a lot of injuries because they transitioned the shoe too quickly. So break the shoe in, and it might even mean that you have to back off some of your mileage as you're transitioning if you need to. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess the last thing I'd say as well is if you find a pair of shoes that you love, going back to our number one rule of comfy shoes, I quite often, this is terrible for my wardrobe space, but buy a couple pairs, because sometimes models do come in and out. They do change, as Mike just said, from model to model of the same shoe.
Yeah.
And if your feet aren't really going to change size, just stock up on the ones which you know feel great for your shoe, for your foot, sorry. And just stick with what works.
Yeah, I'm the same. So I have 2 running shoes that I will wear, and then 9 pairs of Vivos, pairs of Vivos, which are all virtually the same, which are like my daytime wear, but they're all the same shoe. Yeah. And I have 3 pairs of this Tai Chi shoe that I also like to wear. Yeah. And I just wear them. They're all the same, pretty much. It's like 4 different models of shoes in my entire wardrobe.
I know. It's just, you find something you like and you stick with it.
Yeah.
So hopefully that helps a little bit. I know we went into quite a lot of detail, and there's obviously some technical things to think about, and sometimes it can feel overwhelming. But I think, the biggest thing is to think about, just remember that the shoe you put on your feet will have an impact, maybe small, maybe large, on how you run. So that's something just to keep in mind. It's not a good or a bad thing. It's just something to be mindful of. If you are changing shoes, think about what you have been running in to what you're buying now. Are they very similar? Are they quite different? Do you need a bit of a transition phase from your old style of shoe to your new style of shoe? Or do you potentially need to invest in 2 shoes, one for one type of running and one for another type of running as well? Yeah. That's also definitely worth considering.
Yeah. And I think as well, one other final thing I want to say is, you'll go into a foot store and they'll say, you're flat-footed, you need this motion control shoe. You don't. There isn't evidence for it. You are allowed to wear a neutral shoe, and you're allowed to wear whatever feels comfortable. So don't feel pressured just because you have a specific foot type to wear a certain type of shoe if it feels terrible for you. Obviously, medical advice is really, really useful. However, that specific model that they use in running shoes is very outdated. So if it's not coming from specifically from a podiatrist or a foot specialist, just be cautious around that traditional model of shoes, and it can be a useful guide, but don't feel like it's dictating to you what you have to wear.
Yeah. And if you are going into shoe stores, there are definitely stores which are better than others. I know a lot of stores which are fully staffed by amazing runners themselves. I always think the best places to go, because these people have worn these shoes before. They've worn all of them on different terrains for different distances. Yeah. They talk to each other about shoes. They're really passionate.
They race. A lot of them are physios, EPs, all these, runners.
Yeah, the shoe store I used to go into, Victoria Mitchell, I don't know if any of you know her. She's an Olympic steeplechase runner from Sydney. She would be working at this store. And so you know that like people like that actually know what they're talking about. So definitely try to go to a shoe store with their staff are actually runners, because they'll be able to tell you a lot more useful advice.
Yeah.
And apart from that, messages if you have any questions. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Have a great weekend.